The Ghostly Caretaker. When Emma and David first saw the old bed and breakfast, they felt like they'd stepped into a different era. The Victorian-style house, nestled on the outskirts of a small, sleepy town, had an eerie charm that captivated them. Its tall, narrow windows and elaborate woodwork whispered stories of a bygone age. Despite its dilapidated state, they could see the potential. It was a place begging to be restored to its former glory. "This is it," Emma said, her voice tinged with excitement. "Our dream project." David nodded, sharing her enthusiasm. They had always wanted to run a bed and breakfast, a quaint place where travelers could find comfort and charm. This house seemed perfect, and the price was surprisingly affordable. Almost too affordable. The real estate agent, a grizzled man named Mr. Harper, handed them the keys with a strange look in his eyes. "Just remember," he said, his voice low and serious, "this house has a history. Keep it as it is and you'll have no trouble." They laughed it off, attributing his warning to local superstition. But the first night in their new home, as the wind howled outside and the old walls creaked, they began to understand. Emma woke to a chilling draft, despite the windows being shut tight. She pulled the blankets closer, shivering. David was sound asleep beside her, oblivious to the cold that seemed to seep from the walls. Suddenly she heard a noise, a faint rhythmic creaking like footsteps on old wooden floors. She sat up, her heart pounding, straining to hear over the pounding of her own blood in her ears. The footsteps grew louder and then inexplicably stopped right outside their bedroom door. "David," she whispered, shaking him awake. "David, do you hear that?" He groaned and rubbed his eyes. "What is it? Listen." The house was silent again, but then a soft, almost imperceptible whisper reached their ears. It was a voice, indistinct and distant, yet filled with an urgency that sent shivers down Emma's spine. "Do not change, do not disturb." Emma and David exchanged worried glances. The house, it seemed, was already making its presence known. The next day, they explored their new home in daylight. The interior was a labyrinth of narrow hallways and steep staircases, each room filled with antique furniture covered in dust sheets. In the attic, they found old photographs of the previous owners, a stern-looking couple from the early 1900s. Their eyes seemed to follow them, watching, judging. Determined to make the place their own, they started the renovations. But from the moment they moved the first piece of furniture, strange things began to happen. The noises at night grew louder, more insistent. Doors would slam shut without warning, and objects moved inexplicably. Emma found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, feeling an unseen presence watching her every move. One evening, as they painted the dining room, a chill filled the air. Emma's breath came out in visible puffs. The temperature had dropped suddenly, unnaturally. "Do you feel that?" she asked David, her voice trembling. He nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "Yeah, I do." Just then, the chandelier above them flickered and then went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Emma fumbled for the flashlight, her hands shaking. When the light flickered on, they both gasped. Standing in the doorway was a figure barely visible in the dim light. It was an old man dressed in an outdated caretaker's uniform, his eyes hollow and his face gaunt. "You must leave," he said, his voice echoing through the room. Before they could react, the figure vanished, leaving them in stunned silence. Emma and David knew then that their dream project had turned into a nightmare. The ghostly caretaker was real, and he was not pleased with their presence. As they huddled together in the dark, they realized that they were no longer alone in the house. The spirit's warning echoed in their minds, chilling them to the bone. The bed and breakfast had come with more than they bargained for, and it was clear that the ghostly caretaker would do anything to keep the house as it was, no matter the cost. As the night wore on, Emma and David couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the caretaker's spirit was always lurking just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The air was thick with tension and fear, and they knew that their ordeal was far from over. The next morning, Emma and David sat at the kitchen table, their faces pale and drawn. They had barely slept, haunted by the ghostly encounter and the eerie noises that had persisted throughout the night. The sunlight streaming through the windows did little to dispel the sense of dread that had settled over them. "We need to figure out who that was," Emma said, her voice trembling. "Maybe if we understand more about him, we can find a way to make peace." David nodded, though he looked skeptical. "I don't know, Emma. What if we just made things worse?" Emma was determined. "We have to try. We can't live like this." They decided to start with the town's small library. It was an old building, filled with the scent of aged paper and dust. The librarian, a kind elderly woman named Mrs. Thompson, greeted them warmly. "We're looking for information about the previous owners of our house," Emma explained. "It's the old bed and breakfast on Maple Street." Mrs. Thompson's eyes widened slightly. "Ah, the Maple House. That place has quite the history." She led them to a section filled with old town records and newspaper clippings. Emma and David spent hours sifting through the dusty documents, piecing together the story of the house. They discovered that the bed and breakfast had been built in the late 1800s by a wealthy couple, the Harringtons. It had been a thriving business for many years, known for its elegance and charm. But things took a dark turn in the 1920s. According to the records, the Harringtons' only son, Edward, had taken over as the caretaker after his parents passed away. He was known to be a meticulous man, obsessed with maintaining the house exactly as his parents had left it. But as time went on, Edward became more reclusive and paranoid, rarely leaving the property. In 1925, Edward was found dead in the attic, surrounded by old photographs and personal belongings. The cause of death was never determined, but many speculated that he had gone mad, driven by his obsession with preserving the house. "Edward Harrington," David said, staring at a faded photograph of the man. "Do you think he's the one haunting the house?" "It has to be," Emma replied, shivering. "He must still be trying to protect it, even in death." They returned to the bed and breakfast, armed with their new knowledge. That evening, they decided to explore the attic where Edward had died, hoping to find more clues about his connection to the house. As they climbed the narrow staircase, the air grew colder. The attic door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room filled with old trunks and cobweb-covered furniture. The atmosphere was oppressive, the weight of history pressing down on them. Emma found an old journal tucked away in a dusty trunk. She opened it carefully, the pages brittle with age. It was Edward's diary, filled with meticulous entries about his daily routines and his obsession with maintaining the house. One entry caught her eye. Dated just days before his death, it read, "The house must remain as it is. Any change disrupts its balance. I am the guardian, and I will protect it at all costs." "Look at this," Emma said, showing the journal to David. He truly believed it was his duty to protect the house. Suddenly the temperature in the room plummeted, their breaths became visible, and an oppressive silence filled the air. Emma and David felt a presence, a chilling gaze watching them from the shadows. The old wooden floor creaked, and they turned to see the ghostly figure of Edward Harrington standing in the corner, his eyes burning with an intensity that sent shivers down their spines. "You must leave," Edward's voice echoed, colder and more menacing than before. "This house is mine to protect." Emma stepped forward, her voice trembling but determined. "Edward, we know your story. We understand why you're here, but this house can't stay frozen in time forever. We want to honor it, to bring it back to life." Edward's expression flickered, a momentary softness crossing his features before his ghostly form grew darker. "You will regret this," he whispered, his voice echoing through the attic as he vanished once more. As they descended the staircase, Emma and David knew that their encounter with Edward was far from over. The ghostly caretaker's warning echoed in their minds, a chilling reminder that they were not welcome in his house. That night, the disturbances grew more violent. Furniture was overturned, windows shattered, and the sense of dread became almost unbearable. Emma and David realized that if they were to survive, they needed to find a way to appease Edward's restless spirit. But as they huddled together in the dark, they couldn't shake the feeling that something even more sinister was at play. The bed and breakfast held secrets far darker than they had imagined, and they were about to uncover a truth that would make their blood run cold. The next morning, Emma and David awoke to the sound of broken glass crunching underfoot. The living room was a mess. Chairs were toppled, paintings were askew, and the large bay window had shattered, letting in a cold draft. The hostile presence was growing stronger, more violent, and it was clear that Edward Harrington's spirit would not be easily appeased. "We can't keep going like this," David said, his voice edged with frustration. "There has to be a way to make him understand that we're not trying to destroy his legacy." Emma nodded, her eyes scanning the wreckage. "We need to find something, anything that can help us communicate with him. Maybe there's a way to show him that we mean no harm." They decided to search the house more thoroughly, hoping to find something that could provide a connection to Edward's spirit. As they explored each room, they paid close attention to every detail, looking for hidden compartments or secret passages that might hold the key to unlocking Edward's past. In the library, a particularly dusty corner caught Emma's eye. A large, ornate bookshelf stood against the wall, filled with old leather-bound books. Something about it seemed off, as if it didn't quite belong there. She ran her fingers along the spines of the books, feeling for any irregularities. "David, help me with this," she called, and together they began pulling the bookshelf away from the wall. With a groan of protest, the heavy piece of furniture slid aside, revealing a narrow, hidden door. Emma's heart raced as she turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room filled with cobwebs and dust. In the center of the room was an old wooden chest, its surface covered in intricate carvings. "Do you think this belonged to Edward?" David asked, his voice hushed. "Only one way to find out," Emma replied, kneeling beside the chest. She carefully lifted the lid, revealing a collection of personal items: a tarnished pocket watch, a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, and a framed photograph of Edward and his parents. Emma picked up the photograph, studying the faces of the Harrington family. They looked so happy, so proud of their home. She felt a pang of sympathy for Edward, who had been left alone to protect the house after his parents' deaths. Beneath the photograph was a leather-bound book, similar to the journal they had found earlier. Emma opened it, her eyes scanning the pages. It was filled with detailed notes about the house, plans for maintenance, and even sketches of possible renovations. But there was something else too, drawings of strange symbols and notes about rituals meant to protect the house from evil spirits. "Look at this," Emma said, showing the book to David. He wasn't just trying to preserve the house, he believed he was protecting it from something much worse. As they pored over the book, they realized that Edward had been deeply involved in the occult. His obsession with maintaining the house had been driven by a fear of unleashing something dark and malevolent. The rituals he performed were meant to keep whatever lurked within the house at bay. "We need to finish what he started," David said, his voice steady. "If we can complete the rituals, maybe we can put his spirit to rest and protect ourselves from whatever he was afraid of." They gathered the materials listed in the book, following Edward's detailed instructions. As they prepared the ritual, the atmosphere in the house grew tense, the air thick with anticipation. It felt as though the very walls were watching them, waiting to see if they would succeed. That night, they performed the ritual in the parlor, where the disturbances had been most intense. They chanted the incantations, their voices trembling but resolute. As they completed the final steps, a cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candles and plunging them into darkness. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a low, menacing growl filled the air, growing louder and more insistent. The temperature plummeted, and the walls seemed to close in around them. Emma and David held onto each other, their hearts pounding in terror. Suddenly, the growling stopped. A faint ghostly light appeared, illuminating the figure of Edward Harrington. His eyes were filled with sorrow, but there was a sense of relief in his expression. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice echoing through the room. "You have freed me." As Edward's spirit began to fade, a sense of calm settled over the house. The oppressive presence lifted, and the air grew warmer. Emma and David felt a glimmer of hope, believing they had finally found a way to coexist with the ghostly caretaker. But as they prepared to leave the parlor, a chilling realization struck them. The ritual had not just freed Edward's spirit, it had also unlocked whatever dark force he had been protecting the house from. The real terror was just beginning. Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by nightmares and the ever-present sense of being watched. Emma and David awoke to find the house eerily quiet, a calm that felt more ominous than the chaos of the night before. The silence was heavy, oppressive, as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. They decided to revisit the hidden room, hoping to find more clues in Edward's book. As they carefully made their way through the house, they couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in on them, that unseen eyes were tracking their every move. In the hidden room, Emma and David pored over the book once more, desperate for any information that might help them understand the entity they had unleashed. Among the torn pages and cryptic notes, they found a reference to an ancient ritual designed to imprison malevolent spirits, but the instructions were incomplete, missing critical steps. Maybe the local historical society has more information, David suggested. They might have records or old manuscripts that could help us piece this together. Emma agreed, and they hurried to the town's historical society, a small, dusty building filled with artifacts and records from the town's past. The curator, an elderly man named Mr. Whitaker, listened intently as they explained their situation. "I've heard stories about that house," he said, his voice grave. "It's said to be a place of great power, a focal point for supernatural activity. If you've awakened something there, you must be very careful." He led them to a back room filled with old books and manuscripts. "These might have what you're looking for," he said. "But be warned, some knowledge is dangerous." Emma and David spent hours combing through the documents. Finally, they found what they were looking for, a complete version of the ritual to imprison malevolent spirits. The instructions were detailed and precise, but it required a powerful talisman to act as the spirit's prison. "Where are we going to find something like that?" Emma wondered aloud. Mr. Whitaker's face grew serious. "There's an old legend about a talisman buried with the town's founder in the cemetery. It was said to have been used to protect the town from dark forces. If it's real, it might be your only hope." That night, armed with shovels and flashlights, Emma and David made their way to the cemetery. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, casting the graveyard in near total darkness. The air was thick with anticipation and fear. They found the founder's grave, a weathered stone monument covered in moss. As they began to dig, a cold wind whipped through the cemetery, carrying with it faint whispers and distant ghostly laughter. Every shovelful of dirt felt like a battle against the unseen force that surrounded them. Finally, they hit something solid. David carefully uncovered a small, ornate box. Inside, nestled among decaying cloth, was a talisman made of an unknown metal, inscribed with ancient symbols. "This has to be it," Emma said, her voice trembling with a mix of hope and fear. They returned to the house, clutching the talisman tightly. The atmosphere inside was even more oppressive than before, as if the house knew what they were planning. The shadows seemed to writhe and pulse, and the air was thick with a malevolent presence. They set up the ritual in the parlor, following the instructions to the letter. As they began to chant, the house reacted violently. The walls shook, and a deafening roar filled the air, drowning out their voices. The temperature plummeted, and a fierce wind whipped through the room, extinguishing their candles and plunging them into darkness. "Keep going!" David shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. They continued the chant, holding the talisman aloft. The shadows coalesced into a monstrous form, a mass of darkness with glowing red eyes. It lunged at them, but the talisman glowed brightly, holding the entity at bay. With a final desperate effort, they completed the ritual. The talisman flared with a blinding light, and the entity let out a blood-curdling scream as it was drawn into the talisman. The room shook violently, then fell silent. Emma and David collapsed to the floor, exhausted and trembling. The oppressive presence was gone, and the house felt lighter, almost peaceful. They had done it. They had imprisoned the malevolent force. But as they lay there, catching their breath, a slow, mocking clap echoed through the room. They looked up to see a new figure standing in the doorway, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a sinister smile. "Well done," the man said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But you see, there's more than one way to haunt a house." Before they could react, the figure vanished, leaving them in stunned silence. The realization hit them like a ton of bricks. The ritual had only imprisoned one of the many dark forces that lurked within the house. The true horror was far from over. Emma and David stood in the parlor, their relief turning to dread as the sinister figure's words echoed in their minds. The house, it seemed, was a prison not just for one malevolent force, but for many. They had only scratched the surface of the darkness that lay within its walls. "We need to leave," David said, his voice trembling. "We need to get out of here now." Emma nodded, but as they turned to go, the door slammed shut with a thunderous bang. The windows rattled in their frames and a cold wind swept through the house, extinguishing their lights. The air grew thick with an oppressive presence, and the shadows seemed to come alive, writhing and twisting around them. "We can't escape," Emma whispered, her voice filled with terror. "The house won't let us leave." They huddled together, trying to think of a way out. The talisman still glowed faintly in Emma's hand, but it seemed powerless against the new threat. The figure's mocking laughter echoed through the house, growing louder and more menacing with each passing moment. Suddenly, the walls began to bleed. Dark, viscous liquid oozed from the cracks, staining the wallpaper and filling the air with the stench of decay. Emma and David backed away, their hearts pounding in their chests. "We need to find the source of this evil," David said, his voice resolute. "If we can destroy it, maybe we can break the curse." They made their way through the house, the malevolent presence growing stronger with each step. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to reach out, trying to pull them into the darkness. They finally reached the basement, a place they had avoided since moving in. It was the heart of the house, the place where the darkness was strongest. The basement was a cavernous, dimly lit space filled with old furniture and forgotten relics. In the center of the room was a large, ornate mirror, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. As they approached, the mirror began to glow with an eerie, otherworldly light. "This must be it," Emma said, her voice barely audible. "This is the source of the evil." David nodded, and together they began to chant the incantations from Edward's book. The air grew colder, and the mirror's surface began to ripple and distort. The shadows in the room coalesced into a monstrous form, a mass of darkness with glowing red eyes. "You cannot defeat me," the entity hissed, its voice echoing through the basement. "This house is mine." But Emma and David continued the chant, their voices growing stronger and more determined. The talisman in Emma's hand glowed brightly, and the mirror began to crack. The entity let out a blood-curdling scream as it was drawn towards the mirror, its form twisting and contorting as it fought to escape. With a final desperate effort, the mirror shattered, and the entity was sucked into the void. The house shook violently, then fell silent. The oppressive presence lifted, and the air grew warm and still. Emma and David collapsed to the floor, exhausted and trembling. The darkness was gone, and the house felt peaceful once more. They had done it. They had defeated the evil that had plagued the house for so long. But as they lay there, catching their breath, they heard a faint whisper, "You cannot escape." They looked up to see the sinister figure standing in the doorway once more, his hollow eyes filled with malice. "You may have defeated one, but there are many more. The house will always be haunted." The realization hit them like a ton of bricks. The house was a magnet for dark forces, a place where evil would always find a way in. They could never truly escape. With a sense of resignation, Emma and David stood up and walked out of the basement. They would sell the house and leave, but they knew that the darkness would always be a part of their lives. The house had changed them, marked them forever. As they stepped outside into the cool night air, they felt a glimmer of hope. They had survived, and they would continue to fight against the darkness. But they would always be haunted by the memories of the ghostly caretaker and the malevolent forces that had plagued their lives. The bed and breakfast stood silent and empty, a monument to the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. And as the moon rose high in the sky, the shadows inside the house began to stir once more, waiting for their next victims. The end.